This week on the Lectures in History podcast, Stetson University professor David Morton teaches a class on the 1876 Great Sioux War in the South Dakota Black Hills. The conflict included the Battle of Little Bighorn, often called Custer's Last Stand, which was fought June 25th through 26th, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River in what is now southeastern Montana. It remains one of the most famous battles between the U.S. Army and Native American tribes during the era of westward expansion. More after this.
All right, well, hello and welcome. So glad to have you guys here for today's talk. We are in the end game of our first section in this course. And of course, one of the big things I've been attempting to emphasize in section one is the post-Civil War period not just being a moment of political transformation through the political revolution of the Reconstruction period, but also beyond that too, how the United States, in a geographic sense, ends up fulfilling its so-called manifest destiny. In our last lecture, we briefly looked at some clips from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and how John Ford interrogated this idea about this underlying tension that we see in American history. And we saw it very clearly in our Reconstruction section, this idea about truth, liberty, and democracy being this underlying value that guided especially Abraham Lincoln's leadership during the American Civil War and later Republican politicians in terms of pushing forward the Reconstruction amendments, while also at the same time more or less sidestepping this narrative of violence and denial. In today's discussion, I decided instead of telling an entire breakdown of the Plains Wars to focus on one case study that continues to stick with us. It's a war that, much like with the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, remains unresolved, and tensions continue to exist and manifest in a myriad of ways. And that is the war between the Lakota Nation and the United States. I'm going to do a very brief deep dive history of both the Lakota people, also known as the Osheti-Shakowin, and how they emerge essentially as a rival empire in North America. In fact, they consolidate together roughly in and around the year of 1776. So just as the Founding Fathers are gathering in Philadelphia and assembling for the Second Continental Congress, we have this new nation and new empire that is also consolidating its own sense of control on the Great Plains. One thing that I do want to try to debunk is this idea that indigenous tribes remained relatively uncontacted, either with each other or ultimately Europeans when the first colonial arrivals do set foot on the continent. In fact, this breakdown of the various trade networks across the interior of North America, I think also helps to show how the plains are a crossroad of a variety of different civilizations that had been made manifest in the centuries leading up to Columbus's arrival in North America. In particular, we have the Puebloan peoples of the American Southwest and the Mississippian peoples of the East. In fact, the Puebloan peoples, in particular, their settlements in and around Chaco Canyon, boasted populations of at least several thousand people at their height, and in fact experienced a meteoric rise of expansion throughout much of the 12 and 1300s. This is the time, even before our first contact with, of course, any Spanish conquistadors. In fact, by the time the Spanish conquistadors do arrive in what is today's Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, all they find are ruins of this civilization that had been left behind. It's estimated that a period of global cooling that took place in and around the year 1200 led to a drastic reduction in crops. And then it's also estimated that the Puebloan people were victims of their own success, that they cut down too many trees, that they had overexpanded their agriculture, and that led to all-out collapse. Something similar could be said about the Mississippian peoples in the eastern frontier. Near present-day St. Louis lies the ruins of Cahokia, which in the year 1200 could be considered to be one of the largest settlements, not just in North America, but in the world. the population of Cahokia would have been in and about comparable to that of Paris, London, or Rome in the year 1200. And at its heyday, this was a civilization that had incredible soft power as well as a very vibrant trade network. One thing that you may notice just from these maps too is just how American waterways helped to connect these various civilizations together to at least some degree or other. Onto the Great Plains. That said, there of course is a lot of mysticism steeped in this initial first contact. A Cheyenne prophet by the name of Sweet Medicine in roughly maybe the late 18th, possibly early 19th century, we do not have an actual date of when he existed, made a very stark prediction that strangers called Earthmen would one day appear among them, speaking an unknown tongue and carrying with them a strange animal. Anybody want to guess what animal he may have been predicting? Yes?
The horse?
The horse. And this is going to completely and utterly transform every aspect, not just of life of the Cheyenne, but the myriad of nations across the Great Plains. It's worth just briefly noting that the horse originally evolved roughly 2 million years ago in North and South America. And the horse ends up disappearing right around the time that the first indigenous peoples do ascend across the Bering Strait and settle in North and South America. So the horse had been extinct for anywhere between 10 to 12,000 years before European contact. But it's worth thinking about in this sense that the horse, for all intents and purposes, returns to the Americas when ultimately the first Spanish and then later English and Dutch colonists do set foot in the continent. After Apache and Navajo raiders get access to a number of horses after they overthrow the Spanish government in present-day New Mexico, the horse essentially runs wild through much of the Great Plains. And by the time we get to in and about 1770, so again, just as the American Revolution is taking place on the Atlantic seaboard, the horse has now arrived on the Great Plains, fundamentally transforming every aspect of how the people of the Great Plains lived their lives. The ancestral homeland claimed by the Lakota, known as Pahasapa, or the Black Hills, as we know it today, is the area that they ultimately end up landing on. They claim this to be the land of their spiritual guardian, Wakantanka, and how he essentially watches over the earth. Much like what we end up seeing with their Puebloan counterparts, there's this idea that history runs in a series of cycles of both renewal and destruction. And well, we're at the end point of one of these such cycles, at least according to some of these different perspectives. To kind of give you an idea of who the Lakota are, they're part of a much broader language group known as the Sioux. The Sioux is a term that had been ascribed to them by their Arikara enemies. It means snake people. The French first end up coming into contact with the Sioux, and when the French do end up coming in contact, they end up reworking that same terminology. So it's one that we tend to avoid today. Today, the people who identify as the Osheti-Shakowin do have comprised of several different sub-tribes and bands. And of course, we have various different regional claims. It's said that the Lakota initially originated in and around the area of Lake Superior and northern Michigan, and then as with the arrival of the horse, end up arriving into the Great Plains and become these nomadic raiders. And their counterparts in Minnesota, the Dakota, end up taking on a more pastoral approach to their livelihood. They end up taking up farming, and this contrast is, I think, something very essential to think about when we talk about each of these different specific cultures and subcultures. Things do change with, of course, the creation of the United States in 1776. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson issues the Louisiana Purchase, in which he buys from France the land that the eventual Lakota nation would claim. Of course, no indigenous peoples were part of this treaty or this agreement. Jefferson's main goal, and the majority of the money spent on the purchase, was to secure the port of New Orleans. And it's worth thinking about that New Orleans is at the confluence of one of the single greatest natural river systems in the world. This is the way in which Americans gain access to the continental interior. And perhaps most famously, we have Lewis and Clark, who were commissioned by Thomas Jefferson to ultimately explore this interior and this frontier. So of course, the goal of the Lewis and Clark expedition is to find a passageway to the Pacific Ocean. Much along the way, they follow the Missouri River, eventually linking up with the Columbia River and to the Pacific. While on their journey, they do end up encountering Lakota and Dakota peoples. And I think it's worth remarking that Chief Black Buffalo, who encounters the expedition, was very unimpressed by what he initially saw. He also then remarks that essentially nothing really changes. The seasons come and go, strangers come and go. We are here, we will always be here. And this is going to be a recurring theme that we'll be talking about for today. For that part too, the Tetons, which are one of the sub-bands of the Osheti-Shakowin, do show at least a little bit more aggression to the Lewis and Clark expedition compared to some of their other indigenous counterparts. And they later also get chastised by Jefferson for failing to make a proper friendly impression on these peoples. Talking a little bit more about Jefferson, he has a very troubled and checkered relationship, as we've seen, when it comes to the issue of slavery and African Americans, but also his views on Native Americans were equally ruthless. As president, and then subsequently in his retirement, he had some very stark remarks about contact with indigenous peoples and what their future in the confines of the United States would ultimately be. As president, he follows the lead of George Washington in adopting something known as the factory system. Essentially, this creates a network of indebtedness that forces various indigenous tribes and nations to have to sell off their lands to property developers. Most famously, in 1811, we have a Shawnee warrior named Tecumseh who rises up in rebellion. He ends up joining up with the British Army, and during the War of 1812 will lead a number of dramatic insurrections against American forces. And in a letter that Jefferson wrote to Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Adams, he ends up remarking essentially on his views of Tecumseh's war and his expansion in what at the time was the Northwest, meaning today Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and that part of the country. According to Jefferson, he says, some tribes are advancing in the same line. On those who have made any progress, English seduction, so again, they're at war with England at the time, will have no effect, but backward will yield and be thrown further back. Those will relapse into barbarism and misery, lose numbers by war and want, and shall be obliged to drive them with the beasts of the forest into the stony mountains. Again, what we see here with Jefferson is certainly not somebody who sees these individuals as possible trading partners, but essentially an obstacle. And this is part of Jefferson's underlying view, that America is destined to become a continental nation. The Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition, I think, are very telling examples of what his ultimate endgame is. Ultimately, we then see perhaps the most notorious example of these policies put into place under Andrew Jackson. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is not fully implemented until after the Jackson administration comes to an end. But that said, in the underlying lead up to the Indian Removal Treaty, it's quite stark actually to see how Jackson viewed the purpose of the treaty and the forced removal of what Jefferson would have deemed the 5 so-called civilized tribes. So people like the Cherokee Nation, who had actually taken up roots in cabins, had become farmers, had adopted a written language, and had done everything that people like Jefferson and Washington had asked of them. Jackson, in his remarks, said, toward the Aborigines of the country, no one can indulge a more friendly feeling than myself. Always how it works, isn't it? Or would go further in attempting to reclaim them from their wandering habits and make them a happy, prosperous people, rightly considered the policy of general government toward the red man is not only liberal, but generous. So essentially what Jackson's trying to imply is that he's trying to save these tribes, not just from themselves, but also from would-be settlers that are going to displace them. And this is how oppression tends to work, isn't it? The oppressor never actually outright says the thing out loud. They often end up leading into sort of a much more broader and pernicious scheme. Another big change on the American map happens in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the end of the Mexican-American War. In 1847, General Winfield Scott ends up marching on Mexico City, occupying Chapultepec Castle, and forcing the Mexican government to surrender its northwestern territories, so roughly about half of its country. Texas, of course, the entire American Southwest have now joined in the bands of the U.S. claim. And another interesting aspect of this treaty to stand out is that now the U.S. has also taken responsibility for regulating and controlling the indigenous peoples, not just of the Southwest, but in this newly acquired territory, essentially forming an alliance between the U.S. and Mexico to ultimately allow for further displacement and removal. 3 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, what we end up seeing happen is the first major inroads and encroachments into land that the Lakota had claimed for themselves. They illegally end up building a fort called Fort Laramie, and the intention of this fort, along with many of the other forts that will be built along the Missouri River Valley, will be to protect wagon trains, in particular wagon trains that are now marching along the Oregon Trail. In addition to the treaty that ends up acquiring the Southwest, President James Polk also purchases Oregon from the British government, and with that, essentially the United States has now become a fully continental nation. In 1851, there's an effort because, again, the American presence on the Great Plains is still very limited. Much of the country's roughly 25 million person population is still pushed along the Atlantic seaboard. So they had to work with tribal groups. And the ultimate proposal that comes forward through the President Fillmore administration is to create a system in which the indigenous peoples of this territory will be guaranteed land that will remain in their control in perpetuity. Now, why would this be a problem, especially for nomadic peoples who have their entire society built on horseback? Having a fixed set of land that is reserved to them for all time and in perpetuity. Yes?
I mean, the basic nature of being nomadic is that you keep moving.
Certainly.
You can't stay in like one area for the entire time.
And remember how I mentioned before about the plebeians and the Mississippians? Climate change led to the collapse of those respective civilizations. Over-farming were a key driving factor into the collapse of Cahokia, Chaco Canyon, and many of these different settlements. So with the Great Plains, if you've been out to this area, you may see that the sand and land there is not necessarily tenable for very intensive agriculture, despite it being today's America's breadbasket. So of course, if land gets overused by farming, what's going to happen to it? Well, there's a prediction that they give as they start seeing homesteaders starting to arrive in this territory, and that is that it's going to up and blow away. Anybody want to guess what happens within about 3 generations of the Fort Laramie Treaty in the Great Plains? Yes.
The Dust Bowl, right?
So the Dust Bowl, essentially the land up and blows away, and we can consider the Dust Bowl to be one of the single worst man-made ecological disasters in not just American, but perhaps world history. So on that condition, the U.S. also promises to protect native tribes from U.S. citizens. We'll see how well that goes in very short succession. And they also end up providing $50,000 a year, which not a small sum by especially 1850 standards, and supplies for 50 years. Almost as soon as the treaty is signed, it is soon broken and lands are encroached upon even further. And perhaps the most notorious encroachment comes right in the middle of the American Civil War. I think it's worth stressing that Abraham Lincoln, and we've talked about this already in our discussions on the American Civil War and his political perspective. What American politician did he see himself as the successor to? So what person did he constantly quote and constantly hearken back to when he was running for president?
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Yes. So Thomas Jefferson. And that's worth thinking about, right? That Lincoln sees himself as an inheritor to Thomas Jefferson's vision of the United States. And of course, as we have seen, Jefferson had a continental vision of the country. Lincoln adds another component to it. As the Civil War eventually comes to an end, at the same time that he's pondering the Emancipation Proclamation, in fact, the Homestead Act is issued in May of 1862, so we're still a few months away from even his declaration for the Emancipation Proclamation, he is starting to consider what the future of formerly enslaved peoples may look like. And his idea is that first he had talked about repatriation, forcefully removing the former slaves out of the country, but also why not make them homesteaders? Why not allow them to move westward and become essentially the yeoman farmers that Jefferson had described as the foundation of America's values? That becomes part of that tension. Of course, very few former slaves do take up the Homestead Act and its promise, as we have seen for various reasons. Many incoming European immigrants will, along with many East Coasters, and it is one of the most generous and ambitious giveaways of land ever carried out, perhaps in all of world history, by a government. What essentially is put forward by the Homestead Act is that all you have to do is go to a government office, file an application, improve upon the land, file a deed of title after 5 years of improving upon the land, and it's yours. And as we can imagine, the indigenous peoples are going to take issue with this. Why? Why may they have a problem with the Homestead Act? Yes?
Because people start moving into what is originally their land, like basically invading, you know.
Certainly. And again, even if they are not settling directly into, say, land that's been set aside by the territory, what's going to happen when they're drawing additional water resources, overhunting, and again, animals don't know territorial boundaries. Nature doesn't follow these kind of lines. So this is also going to have a very profound impact also on the quality of life, even in the land that is reserved and boxed off for them. Matters come to a head almost immediately after the Homestead Act is issued. In the summer of 1862 in present-day Minnesota, we end up seeing growing tensions between the leader of the Dakota, Chief Little Crow, and many of the white settlers who have now descended upon the state. Minnesota had less than 5,000 or 6,000 white settlers in the 1850s. By 1862, it's looking at roughly about 250,000 people. One very infamous remark, as more and more of the Dakota are being displaced and disenfranchised through the actions of the Homestead Act, comes from a homesteader named Andrew Myrick, who remarks, "I wish you could come up and help straighten out the snarl the Indians have got us in. I have not talked with them yet, seeming it best to let them go hungry first, hoping they might retract and become decent again. So far as I'm concerned, if they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." Uprising happens very soon after he makes this quote, and he literally ends up eating his words. He's found dead with grass stuffed inside his mouth. And in fact, thus begins the Dakota Uprising of 1862. Colonel Sibley, who was the first elected governor for the state of Minnesota, ends up forming a militia squad to rein in the rebelling Dakota under Chief Little Crow's control. And General Pope ends up overseeing the operation. And of course, these are his orders. "It's my purpose to utterly exterminate the Sioux, if I have the power to do so, and even if it requires a campaign lasting the whole of next year. Destroy everything belonging to them and force them out to the plains, unless, as I suggest, you can capture them. They are to be treated as maniacs or wild beasts, and by no means as people whom treaties or compromises can be made. So any of these existing treaties are now being torn up. We're at war. This quote, I think, should also invoke another example we already talked about, right? This sounds like Jefferson. That same kind of term about wild beasts and maniacs certainly invokes the same aspect of Jefferson's remarks toward Tecumseh and his Shawnee uprising in the 1810s. Sibley ends up organizing the surrounding militia, and of course, as we've seen, by this time, this uprising then ends up becoming almost statewide. Chief Little Crow and many of his followers do offer safe passage and asylum to white settlers that they knew to be friendly with. In fact, a widow ends up hiding out in Little Crow's home for almost the entirety of the uprising. But after about 6 weeks, by September 1862, so this is the same time as the Battle of Antietam is happening in the East Coast of the United States, the rebellion is put down. And essentially, with that, Little Crow will initially flee to Canada. And the question now is what to do with the Dakota rebels, many of whom end up helping to oversee the return of hostages that had been taken during the war. And many come in good faith. Eventually, a trial is held by many of the participants in this rebellion. And in Manteco, Minnesota, which was one of the largest settlements at the time, we end up seeing an assemblage of Dakota who helped to return the hostages now go on trial. And as the trial register is being called for, they will also be asked just a very simple question. Did you fire shots in this war? And if you admitted to firing any shots whatsoever, there was a very clearly marked D for death. And with that, 303 of the Dakota warriors who came in to Manteco are now slated for the death penalty. There's an appeal made to none other than Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln agonizes over this list of 303 men, and he ultimately ends up determining that there are 39 that are guilty, and then after an initial review, he ends up removing one more man. The execution of the Dakota 38 happens on December 26th, 1862. Anybody know what happens on January 1st, 1863? So we're talking just a matter of days later, another major issue that Abraham Lincoln is looking to resolve. So this really is the entire reason the Civil War is being fought. Yes?
Emancipation.
So the Emancipation Proclamation. So within 5 days of Abraham Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he ends up overseeing the single largest mass execution carried out in American history. Many of the men who end up marching to the gallows will remark that they had been misled and betrayed, and not even fully understanding why they are being executed. They will all hold hands and sing songs as they descend into the gallows. And with this, we're getting a sense also of, well, the legitimacy of these types of treaties. Chief Little Crow does return to Minnesota within a year, but by the following summer, he then is killed by a band of settlers. He's scalped, and in fact, his scalp was put on display in the Minnesota Capitol. And then later, Colonel Sibley, who also was the head of Minnesota's Historical Society, ends up preserving the scalp and keeping it on very gruesome display for quite an amount of time. Again, I think I can't stress enough that, again, the Civil War is not the only war that is unfolding during the period between 1861 and 1865. In fact, Lincoln, after the election of 1864, ends up discussing with Governor Ramsey why he got less votes in Minnesota in the 1864 election than he did in the 1860 election. And the governor was very glib about it. He said, if you let us kill more Indians, you would have gotten more votes. That said, going into the winter of 64, just after Lincoln had now been secured in re-election, we see one of the most notorious mass killings carried out by American armed forces in U.S. history in eastern Colorado. Chief Black Kettle, who is known as the Peace Chief, He dedicated his life to trying to reconcile these growing tensions between settlers and his Arapaho and Cheyenne people, will march under the U.S. flag and a white flag and confront a very ambitious Army commander by the name of John M. Chivington, who was eager to get a seat in the U.S. Congress. So again, as we've seen in the West, killing Indians means more votes, and he knows that if he can win a decisive military victory, this could be the launch of an incredible political career. His ambition ultimately is further accelerated by the fact that his men are on a 100-day enlistment. That enlistment's set to end at the end of 1864, so he needed a decisive strike. He'll claim an incredible military victory that kills between 500 or 600 Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors. Most historians today agree that more than likely 2/3 of the people killed in the ensuing massacre were women and children, and about 150 of those were killed. Black Kettle will escape for the time being and continue to commit himself to peace and attempting to negotiate these ongoing tensions. Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell of Colorado, the first Cheyenne elected to the United States Senate, will later remark that this was one of the most disgraceful moments in American history. In fact, the massacre was so disgraceful that even the United States Army called Chivington back to Washington to account for his actions. The problem was that the 100-day enlistment had ended, so by that point, Chivington was a civilian, so he could not be tried in a military tribunal, never faces any charges for murder, and in fact, even 20 years later, he never shows any remorse. There was a reunion of the Colorado Guards 20 years later. He remarks, "I stand by Sand Creek." 1866 is where things begin to escalate further. So now we're past the Civil War, but a whole new war is now beginning on the American frontier. As the 51 Fort Laramie Treaty continues to be violated, a chief by the name of Red Cloud will lead a series of raids across a number of forts along the Bozeman Trail, and perhaps most notoriously end up launching a decisive strike against American forces. The Fetterman Massacre, or also known as the Battle of the 100 Slain, killed about 80+ men, and this is, at least for the moment, the single largest victory carried out by a member of the Plains tribes against American forces. And at least until then, this was the worst military disaster the U.S. Army would face. There's more to come, for sure. Red Cloud is so successful in his ongoing war with the American people that he ends up forcing, once again, now the Andrew Johnson administration to come to the negotiating table. A new Fort Laramie Treaty is drawn up. 25 million acres of land are now promised in perpetuity, including the Black Hills of South Dakota, and a creation of a massive sprawling reservation and territory that will give them a little bit more free range. In addition to that, then, too, the U.S. promises to close the Bozeman Trail and prevent additional overhunting. The government would provide agency to oversee the reservation, building additional infrastructure for them. And this is where we start to get some tension that will later play out in some very destructive ways. The Sioux children will be compelled to attend school and receive agricultural instruction. So again, that's still that Jeffersonian view, right? Or Jacksonian view even too, that indigenous peoples can be converted from nomadic plainsmen to farmers. So as you can see here, the territory is essentially reorganized into what makes up about half of today's state of South Dakota, and then also portions of present-day North Dakota. That said, by the time we get to the election of 1868, there's this underlying concern. Ulysses S. Grant will secure the nomination for the Republican Party in that election, and he will, even himself, despite having a much more gregarious reputation compared to many of his other counterparts, have some relatively choice words to say, that even if the extermination of every Indian tribe was necessary to secure the result of the protection of these wagon trains, this may be necessary. William Tecumseh Sherman, so again, his middle name being a gesture to the Shawnee Raider who had risen up against the American government in the 1810s, will further remark, and mind you, he's coming right after his scorched earth campaign in Georgia and ultimately winning the Civil War in the Deep South for the U.S. Armed Forces. He'll remark that we must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children. Nothing else will reach the root of this cause. And of course, the supreme commander of the West at this period is another major Civil War general, Philip Sheridan, the first Irishman to achieve the rank of Major General in the United States Armed Forces. And Sheridan, of course, will very infamously, allegedly remark that the only good Indian I ever saw were dead. Now, this has been debated and looked over. Sheridan himself had denied that he had made that remark, but often with these kinds of apocryphisms, they get repeated enough times that they become, well, fact. Let's enter into the story, one of the most infamous and famous figures of the American West of this period. So George Armstrong Custer was an upstart military commander, finished last in his class at West Point. Very fittingly enough, he was part of the graduating class of 1861. He later ends up taking up ranks under General McClellan, and he plays a major role in some of the early engagements of the Civil War, but his first breakout surely comes with the Battle of Gettysburg. He's widely credited by most military historians as one of the key figures behind the Union Army's victory against Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy. His unwillingness to waver and retreat in the face of a cavalry charge carried out by General J.E.B. Stuart helped to keep the Army of Northern Virginia in line and ultimately forced Lee backwards. Custer will remain as a major figure, of course, ultimately promoted to general. And in fact, he'll be there when the first flag of truce is surrendered to none other than him. And he'll be right in Grant's presence when Robert E. Lee ends up issuing his unconditional surrender in April of 1865. War ends. We see a massive de-enlistment and, of course, deaccession of the U.S. Army. Custer stays on, and now he's looking for a new command and a new campaign. He's demoted from general to colonel, at least now, again, in his new reorganized armed forces, and he's looking for opportunity. And it's in Oklahoma that he ends up encountering none other than Chief Blackkettle, the very same Blackkettle who had survived the Sand Creek Massacre. The massacre that ends up occurring at the Washita River in Oklahoma was modeled almost right out of the Shivington playbook. It was an indiscriminate killing of a settlement, and this time Blackkettle does not make it out alive. And again, this is where the beginning of that Custer legend is starting to be branded and created. Custer was his own best PR man. You can kind of see it even just from this photo. What kind of image do you think he's trying to send to especially East Coast newspaper readers back home? Yes?
Well, I'm a rough and tough American frontiersman fighting for you.
So certainly, right? He had now rebranded himself from this, he was known as long hair by the indigenous peoples of the plains, but he had long curly locks. He was sort of the embodiment of a cavalier warrior in the Civil War. And now he goes through an image rebranding where he now is sort of the manifestation of this newly encroaching frontier. Another major development that happens, of course, at the end of the 1860s is the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which, as you can see here, is built over a number of different claimed indigenous lands. The meeting at Promontory Junction in Utah on May 10th, 1869, is a turning point in so many ways in American history. I can't stress enough the significance of the Transcontinental Railroad and its role in not just the history of the West, but how Americans see themselves. This is, for all intents and purposes, the moon landing of the 19th century. 100 years later, you'll have Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, and people from around the world will be glued to their television sets as they see him ultimately set foot on this new alien body. In 1869, Americans across the country knew the exact moment that Leland Stanford nailed the golden spike into the railway at Promontory Junction. Anybody know how that people across the country, regardless of where they were, would have known the exact moment that this happened? Yes?
Telegraph?
So telegraph. There was a telegraph wire tied to that golden spike. Sanford, of course, missed it at first. Then he had to have an assistant finish the job. But across the country, regardless of where you were, East Coast, West Coast, North, South, you knew the moment that this railroad was created. And this is what we call in media scholarship a simultaneous happening, a major event where we all know exactly the moment we were when it happened. And this is the first time, arguably in world history, that people in the United States would know a singular event happened at the moment it actually occurred.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Of course, with the railroad, this brings more destruction to the Great Plains. The cattle ranges that soon extend even on land that is not claimed by the reservation system bring wanton destruction to the buffalo, which are kind of the primary source of food and resources and supplies to much of the Great Plains tribes. William Hornady of the National Zoological Park had a analysis, sort of a post-mortem, of the buffalo, which by 1889 had reduced in numbers to just less than several thousand. He, of course, does give account to the fact that it was man's reckless greed and the absence of protective measures. So today we would call this wildlife conservation. We won't see any of this firmly put into place until the Theodore Roosevelt administration in the early 1900s. That hunters, generally both white and red, so notice how he also blames the Plains tribes as well for their need for robes, and he also blames the animals. He says that they were phenomenally stupid, and again, this is part of that underlying theme that we end up seeing when it comes to manifest destiny, this sense of inevitability and justification, and often sometimes pushing the blame backward. And of course, well, the perfection of weapons technology that makes these kind of massive assemblages of buffalo possible. 1870, Chief Red Cloud, who had negotiated the Fort Laramie Treaty, travels to Washington. And Grant, to a degree, softens his tone when he does meet with Chief Red Cloud. He'll have some very wonderful things to say about him. But also, as you could see, and these are some pretty questionable political cartoons from the period, what kind of impression do you get of this interaction based on like the way the political cartoons are positioned? Of course, you have Grant with his signature cigar in his mouth in both cases. Do you think these cartoons are supporting his meeting with Red Cloud? Not at all, right? And if anything, especially this part here where he's, well, this says here, Robinson Crusoe making a man of his Friday. Anybody know the reference here? Anybody read Robinson Crusoe? So Friday was the indigenous person on the shipwrecked island that Robinson Crusoe attempts to try to communicate with. And again, this sort of is like very reductive view that we end up seeing. As for Red Cloud and his part, he remarks that the Great Spirit had made all things that I have in my country wild. I have to hunt them up. It is not like you who go out and find what you want. I have eyes. I see all you whites, what you are doing, raising stock, etc. I know that I will have to come to that in a few years myself. It is good. I have no more to say. What's he implying here with this quote? Again, this is a very public remark. He's a politician just as much as he's a chief and a leader. So what is he acknowledging in this interview? Is he going to remain nomadic? Is he going to remain on the plains and continue hunting buffalo? Yeah. So some will, and we will talk about that in just a second, because he is going to upset quite a few Lakota with this particular remark. Essentially, he's acknowledging the fact that he will have to learn to become a farmer, that he's going to learn to have to be somebody who settles down on a set-aside land that's allotted to him. And how do you think some Lakota may feel with these kind of remarks about Red Cloud? Yes.
They probably feel betrayed, you know, because it's in their culture to keep moving, and you know they just probably feel betrayed as a people.
And this is the man who won, at least up until this point, the most decisive victory for the tribes of the plains, right? There's that sense of betrayal that now he's willing to. Why do you think he decides that the time has come to settle onto set-aside land? Why do you think he makes this choice? Yes.
Probably because, I mean, like, U.S. weapons technology has advanced to the point where they really can't fight it too well anymore.
Mm-hmm. So this is a man who's gone to war with the United States. He, for all intents and purposes, won the war and forced the Americans to come to the negotiating table. He also, I think, understands the limits of what he can ultimately mobilize. Matters do come to a pretty decisive head, though, soon after. As with the 1851 treaty, the 68 treaty is soon going to be violated by none other than George Armstrong Custer, who in 1874 will lead an expedition into the Black Hills. In this expedition, he not only discovers, of course, buffalo, but also gold reserves. And mind you, we're coming off of the California gold rush. So now that the Black Hills, a territory that had been set aside for in perpetuity for the Sioux people, has now been discovered to have gold, do you think any aspect of that treaty is going to be recognized? And of course, Custer is going to help the settlers in finding their pathways into the best access to the gold fields. War is soon brewing as a result, and we end up seeing the onset of yet another major gold rush. And just as with the California gold rush, which was equally destructive to the indigenous peoples of California, California had an indigenous population of nearly 300,000 before the gold rush, and it is utterly decimated in a matter of decades afterward. This is where we're introduced to Chief Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull was a major player in the Red Cloud War and had fought alongside Red Cloud. He was somebody who felt fundamentally betrayed by this concession that had been made. And he had called for, at all costs, any kind of resistance to the Fort Laramie Treaty. He also promised to his supporters and soldiers that he had seen a vision of American soldiers seemingly falling from their encampment like stars from the sky. These soldiers, as thick as grasshoppers, will fall upside down into a Lakota camp. And he's predicting an even greater victory than what Red Cloud before him could have brought forward. One of his primary allies and lieutenants was a man by the name of Whitco, better known as General Crazy Horse. And Crazy Horse had studied American cavalry for at least a decade by this point and had won a number of very decisive campaigns. He, of course, is now very famously going to be enshrined in the Black Hills, quite close to Mount Rushmore. In fact, the very same sculptor, Korshak Zolkowski, was the person behind, ultimately, the initial design for the Crazy Horse Memorial. So Crazy Horse now has also assembled a warrior band of Oglala Lakota, while also another chief by the name of Gall, who had escaped captivity from the Americans and will become a very decisive commander in this upcoming battle, will continue to organize and resist the encroaching settlement. This is where we also see a call for resistance, not just in a military sense, but in a spiritual sense. The sun dances, which the Oyates of the 7 sub-tribes of the Lakota people will have on an annual basis, will ultimately come together in an effort also to call upon their spiritual ancestors to protect their land and rid themselves of the white settlers. This is actually a really interesting clip that I have here of a reenactment of one of these sun dances and how they were carried out. So this, in fact, was filmed in 1894 at Thomas Edison's Black Maria studio. So the people you are seeing perform and carry out one of these sun dances very likely would have been on the Great Plains carrying out many of these same types of invocations. So a lot of very interesting cultural anthropology that was done in the early films recorded by Edison and W.K.L. Dixon. So let's get right to it. In our last class, we talked a little bit about the Battle of Little Bighorn. And from our conversation, what do we remember about the battle? Why was it significant or not significant? Yes.
It was a massacre.
So it was a very decisive massacre, right? Roughly 260 American soldiers under George Custer are killed in likely less than an hour. In the grand scheme of the settlement of the American West and the Great Plains, was this a decisive battle? In fact, we talked about this, right? What happened when historians in the Midwest tried to rewrite the history of the West and omit the Battle of Little Bighorn? What did the textbook companies and the school districts do? Yes?
They revolted, against it.
So they pushed back, right? They definitely did not want to accept a book that did not have this story front and center. And of course, what was it about the Battle of Little Bighorn that is so compelling and so intriguing? I'm sure you all have heard of Custer's last stand, at the very least, coming into this class. So what is it about Custer's last stand, or this idea of a last stand, that is so compelling to our understanding of American history? Yes?
We had talked about that it was just the idea of the last stand, the last one standing in something they believe in.
Can we think of an earlier example of a last stand that had happened, maybe not directly in American history, but associated to American history? Yes?
The Alamo.
So last stand at the Alamo, right? So Davy Crockett, this idea of, again, these individuals who had stood up against Santa Anna and his onslaught in San Antonio, that becomes one part of it. Of course, beyond that then too, the death of Custer itself is left in all kinds of mysticism. It's alleged that when his body was discovered, first he had his eardrums pierced so that he could hear better in the other world, and that he had a smile on his face. And Custer's smile was one of the most compelling aspects of sort of the mystery of his death. Two Moons, the Cheyenne chief who was involved in the battle, remarked that it took no longer than it takes a hungry man to eat its meal. So we're talking a matter of maybe 15, 20 minutes. Custer and his entire band are wiped out. But we have to think about the timing of this last stand. The battle takes place on June 25th, 1876. There's a major holiday right around the corner. Anybody know what holiday I'm talking about? Yes?
Independence Day.
So Independence Day. And this is not just any American Independence Day, is it? It's Independence Day 1876. Why is this even more important? Yes?
100 years.
So this is America's 100-year anniversary. So also at the same time, there is a presidential election soon looming. Custer, again, seeing a pathway to a possible political career. He's only 36 years old when he is annihilated at Little Bighorn, knows that the Democratic Party convention is happening in July of 1876. What if he were to slip in a decisive victory and manage to sweep in and win the nomination? He could ultimately then perhaps use this to catapult his own political career. All of that's factored in. So the news of the battle does not actually hit the east coast of the U.S. until July 6th, so several days after. But how do you think most Americans are going to react to the death of Custer? Again, the man known for winning the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the embodiments of the American frontier. How do you think they would react? Yes?
I don't think they'd be too happy about it.
Certainly. I mean, this is, again, fitting enough for today, the 9/11 of 1876, of late 19th century America. This is the moment where many Americans now are also going to rally to enlist and essentially avenge the 7th Cavalry. Beyond that then too, and we could even see just how the mythology is built around Custer almost as soon as his death occurs. This idea of him heroically making this last stand in the face of overwhelming odds. Perhaps one of the most famous embodiments of the battle comes from a beer advertisement, fittingly enough. This is an ad from Budweiser made in the 1890s depicting Custer's last stand. What can we gather from looking at this image and the way it's designed and the kind of messaging it's looking to carry out? So, like, what impression do we get of Custer from this particular image? Yes?
He's standing up against overwhelming odds against savage natives, essentially.
So this goes right back to the Alamo again, doesn't it? This idea that he is the embodiment of this last stand, heroically, almost literally becoming the last man standing. What does this tell Americans about themselves and their sense of self and identity? Yes?
That we'll fight till the last breath, that we're just fighters.
Absolutely. Again, this is that embodiment of the frontier spirit. What's the read on the Cheyenne and Arapaho and Lakota warriors in the scene? It's almost like a zombie movie where you have that last person who's about to be swarmed by them, right? It's this idea that he is the heroic embodiment of pushing on to the frontier, and he paid the ultimate price for it. Chief Red Horse, who was an eyewitness to the battle, had a very different account. In fact, many of the later Lakota soldiers who took up arms against the United States will be taken captive and sent to the Castillo San Marcos, which at the time was Fort Marion. Some will end up doing a number of sketchings of their impressions of the battle. So this is the Cheyenne version. What do we notice that's different? Yes?
It's only like one soldier on both sides, or warrior.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more even-handed. About 80 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors are killed in this battle. I think it's worth bringing that up, too. It's not just a one-sided massacre. Beyond that, then, too, it just shows you a lot more of the dimensions that had happened. It's estimated that Custer very quickly got overwhelmed. Whether or not he was one of the last people to die, or whether or not it was actually his brother who may have done a mercy killing to him, is still left to all kinds of speculation that we don't have time to necessarily explore. And one thing I wanted to focus on is the way popular memory has conducted this idea about the last stand. I have two still frames from two movies, roughly 30 years apart, that I feel could not be more different in the way they depict the final moment of George Custer. And as we've seen from some of the other film clips we've looked at in our class, right, what about Custer has changed between the year 1941 and 1970? He's dead, right? He's in the ground, he's gone. But the impression of Custer certainly has very dramatically changed. So in this first image, we have Custer flanked with the flag of the 7th Cavalry, literally the last man standing, played by Errol Flynn. Of course, like what the look on his face gives you is sort of this very strong determinism, right? The question is, why do you think America in 1941 needs Custer to be the hero in this kind of way? Yes?
Because there's a world war going on and they need that motivation.
Absolutely. Now, They Died With Their Boots On does come out just before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but Japan and Germany are ravaging Europe and East Asia. President Roosevelt has already called for the first peacetime draft in American history, and it's a very likely conclusion that America may enter World War II. Is it a foregone conclusion that this is a war the United States will win if it were to go to war with Japan and Germany? Very likely not. And this is where Custer then becomes that embodiment of somebody who will fight to the last person, even if the odds are completely overwhelming and over-encompassing. This is the last moment of Custer in a movie, Little Big Man, year 1970. What's changed between 1941 and 1970? Yes?
Custer looks a lot less heroic. He's not being portrayed as like a brave last stand, a brave man committing a last stand here.
Yeah, so he's completely caught off guard too, right? He's shot in the back, and he was actually about to shoot one of his men just as he gets basically executed. He is completely overwhelmed and not up to the task. And he's almost depicted as a deranged lunatic in this sequence. So the question is, why in 1970 do we get this version of Custer? Yes?
I believe the Vietnam War was going on. And a lot of people during that time did not believe that we should be in it, and therefore, was depicted as deranged, or that we shouldn't have been in it in the first place.
So he becomes the embodiment of that Vietnam era imperialism. A year earlier, just as this film was being made, revelations of the My Lai massacre, where 560 civilians in South Vietnam had been killed by U.S. armed forces, had circulated across news stations. Americans are now drawing direct comparisons to the Plains Wars, to some of the less than savory actions being carried out in the Vietnam War. And of course, we've seen an evolution over time of a number of these different variations of Custer. That said, by the time we get to the late 1960s and early 1970s, that Vietnam era, there's also a growing civil rights movement for Native Americans. 1969 is the year that Alcatraz is occupied by indigenous rights activists, and Vine Deloria Jr. comes out with a book called Custer Died for Your Sins. And I feel like he sums it up quite succinctly here. Not knowing how Vietnam's yet going to go, he remarks, America has never lost a war, but name, if you can, the last peace the United States has won. Victory, yes, but this country has never made a successful peace, because peace requires exchanging ideas, concepts, thoughts, and recognizing the fact that two distinct systems of life can exist together without conflict. Consider how quickly America seems to be facing its allies of one war as new enemies. And of course, well, post 9/11, there is another reevaluation. One of the more stark reevaluations, of course, is directed to the men who served in the armed forces, and not necessarily scapegoating them in the way that you would have seen in the Vietnam War era, that we are no longer going to blame the warriors. The fact that roughly 1/3 of Custer's men were newly arrived immigrants who had lived in the United States less than 2 to 3 years before embarking on this campaign is one such example of this, that a activist named Newt Berger ends up remarking that the lesson of this massacre is about the limits of the culture of narcissism. Again, that personality and that cult of personality that Custer was trying to build for himself. And that ultimately is the last stand with 9/11, but it does offer a lesson that there is a danger in seeing anything too simplistically. And of course, that's what brought Custer to his downfall, and in many ways, our own evaluation of that history. Of course, now the full might of the United States military has descended upon the Lakota Nation. In October of 1876, Crazy Horse is forced to surrender, and Sitting Bull, ever defiant, comes across a man known as the Grand Old Man of the Army, General Nelson Miles. And this is a clip from the movie Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. In this sequence that we're about to see, I'll have to go to the other one here. You will see an encounter between Sitting Bull and Nelson Miles. And in this encounter, you'll see these two radically different views of the history of the American West and the history of these two peoples.
Sitting Bull requested this counsel. We await his word.
Take your soldiers out of here. They scare the game away.
Very well, sir. Tell me then, how far away should I take my men?
You must take them out of our lands.
What precisely are your lands?
These are the lands where my people lived before you whites first came.
I don't understand. We whites were not your first enemies. Why don't you demand back the land in Minnesota where the Chippewa and others forced you from years before?
The Black Hills are sacred land given to my people by Wakantoka.
Very convenient to cloak your claims in spiritualism. And what would you say to the Mormons and others who believe that their God has given to them Indian lands in the West?
I would say they should listen to Wakantoka.
legends say. You didn't sprout from the plains like the spring grasses, and you didn't coalesce out of the ether. You came out of the Minnesota woodlands, armed to the teeth, and set upon your fellow man. You massacred the Kiowa, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Oto, and the Pawnee without mercy. And yet you claim the Black Hills as a private preserve bequeathed to you by the Great Spirit.
And who gave us the guns and powder to kill our enemies? And who traded weapons to the Chippewa and others who drove us from our home?
Chief Sitting Bull, the proposition that you were a peaceable people before the appearance of the white man is the most fanciful legend of all. You were killing each other for hundreds of moons before the first white stepped foot on this continent. You conquered those tribes, lusting for their game and their lands, just as we have now conquered you for no less noble a cause.
This is your story of my people.
This is the truth, not legend. Crazy Horse has surrendered with his entire band. And by his surrender, he says to you and your people that you are defeated. And by ceding the Black Hills to us, so say Red Cloud and the other chiefs who demand that you end this war and take your place on the reservation.
Red Cloud is no longer a chief. He is a woman you have mounted and had your way with. Do not speak to me of Red Cloud.
I suppose you are the only chief then. Sitting Bull is king of all the Indians. Humility, one of the four virtues of a Sioux chief. Sitting Bull shows his true nature now.
I have had my say with you.
And I have had my say with you.
Then we will have a fight.
So be it.
So I think we could already guess how this goes. Known as the Battle of Cedar Creek, the showdown between Nelson Miles and Sitting Bull is quite decisive. Sitting Bull manages to escape, and he seeks asylum in Canada, and the remaining Lakota are rounded up and now forced onto set-aside reservations, with the Black Hills not included as territory granted to them. As you can see, Nelson Miles, what do we notice about Nelson Miles that's different than what we've seen about Custer? Just from even this clip. Again, this is a reenactment. We don't know what the two men actually said when they encountered one another. Yes?
He comes off more as reasonable or wanting peace, when obviously, as history has told us, that is not really, or was not really the case.
And for what it's worth, he's trolling him too, isn't he? He's coming right out by saying, this is the history that I see with your people, that you were conquerors, that you are also your own manifestation of westward expansion. And they are. They are a people that had moved westward and had created a new society, a new life for themselves. But that tension, right, is very much made manifest when it comes to this particular engagement. Sitting Bull, for his part, will remain in Canada for the next 4 years under the protection of the British government, but the lands in Alberta and Saskatchewan that his men will end up attempting to languish on will not be sustainable. And in 1881, he will end up surrendering and taking his place on the reservation, settling in one of two cabins on the Standing Rock Reservation. Several years later, a traveling showman by the name of Buffalo Bill Cody will ultimately meet Sitting Bull and offer him a publicity contract. In fact, he will then offer Sitting Bull to come with him to the East Coast and do reenactments of the great battles of the American West. Anybody want to guess what battle most Americans are itching, especially on the East Coast, to see reenacted? Yes?
Custer's Last Stand.
So Custer's Last Stand. And why not actually have the real Sitting Bull there to reenact that version of it? I have here, just very shortly, a overview of one of my all-time favorite Western movies. It interrogates this idea of how we look at and construct American history. Buffalo Bill Cody, the flamboyant showman, and his very unlikely relationship with Chief Sitting Bull. Notice this comes out in 1976, 100 years after the Battle of Little Bighorn, and right in the midst of this reevaluation of the story of the American West. I think we only have time for a minute of it, but it can give you sort of a sense of how, by the 1970s, we're taking a very different look of this history.
Settle back in your seats, ladies and gentlemen. You are about to become a part of American history. Dio de Laurentiis presents the David Sussman production of Robert Altman's absolute original and heroic enterprise of inimitable luster, Buffalo Bill and the Indian, or Sitting Bull's history lesson. This magnificent entertainment stars Paul Newman as the monarch of the Wild West, the noblest white skin of them all, William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill.
Someday my hair is going to be as long as Custer's.
Joel Bray is the producer.
Nate Salisbury doesn't belong to win, but he does want to say he's proud that you're proud. What do you mean by that?
Kevin McCarthy as the publicist.
This is an extremely impressive assemblage.
Gerald E. Chaplin as Annie Oakley. Harvey Keitel as the nephew. Uncle Will!
Control yourself.
Frank Gatwich and Bill Sampson as Sitting Bull and his interpreter.
Chief Sango has chosen to speak through me.
Pat McCormick and Shelley Duvall as the president and his first lady.
Big Father, Sango has waited to ask you a very simple thing for his people.
I remind you that in government, nothing is simple.
And Burt Lancaster as Ned Buntline, the legend maker.
So I say to the kid, from now on your name is Buffalo Bill.
It also features brave cowboys, fierce Indians, countless feats of Western skill and daring, and priceless gems of frontier wisdom.
Difference between a white...
I'll stop here, and just based on the trailer alone, what kind of impression do we get of like the tone of the movie and its approach to the history? Yes?
It kind of comes off as very one-sided to the story. Definitely more the like U.S. side of the story.
So it's very U.S. focused, as you know, Buffalo Bill Cody's mythology and self-made mythology will certainly manifest. But it's very lighthearted, isn't it? It's very tongue-in-cheek. It's satire. Robert Altman, as a director, was very well known for also a movie called MASH, which was a satire on the Korean War. He couldn't talk directly about the Vietnam War, so he used the Korean War as a stand-in. You can almost see this also as that kind of confrontation between history and memory. And, well, in the very short amount of time that we have, I do want to try to bring this all full circle for how this war comes to its conclusion. Crazy Horse, as you saw, does surrender to U.S. forces, and within several months he ends up taking up, basically being sent to a prison of war camp in Nebraska, where he'll be shot in the back and killed. 4 days before his execution, if you will, it's alleged that he had a meeting with Sitting Bull in Pahasapa, in which he remarked that one day, 7 generations from now, the circle will be made whole again. Anybody want to guess how many generations we are from the Battle of Little Bighorn and the time of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse? This is what I call a leading question. We're in this moment right now, and we're in this moment of confrontation. Of course, the land is then ceded, and also, just as notoriously, there is this ongoing slogan, kill the Indian, save the man. Children, as we discussed in our last lecture, are forcefully removed and sent mostly to boarding schools in the East Coast of the United States, forced to forget their ancestral religion, their language, their sense of self and identity. This too has raised a number of other ongoing challenges and questions around, especially the America that is now starting to form at the end of the 19th century. Perhaps most strikingly, we see the example of these various accounts of what unfolded. Now, just very quickly, another postscript. Sitting Bull, for his part, is ultimately executed on December 15th, 1890, by Indian Affairs agents. It was said that he had a prophecy that he would one day be betrayed by a member of his own tribe, and that ends up becoming the case here. The execution of Sitting Bull became a sensation within the American public imaginary. In 1893, the cabin in which he was shot and killed by Indian Affairs agents was actually bought and then sent to Chicago to be put on display at the Chicago World's Fair Pavilion. And it became one of the most sought-after attractions of that entire gathering. Just 14 days after the killing of Sitting Bull, Spotted Elk, the chief, also known as Bigfoot, calls for a ghost dance, a collective prayer carried out by the Lakota people to resurrect the spirits of their ancestors and rid the continent once and for all of the presence of these settlers. American troops under the banner of the U.S. 7th Cavalry would then set fire after attempting to disarm a man who was deaf, and about 250 men, women, and children are killed in the ensuing onslaught. Thus, the Battle of Wounded Knee is heralded in many American newspapers as an effective closing of the frontier and the Plains Wars. Of course, just to give a brief contrast to this, at that very same Chicago World's Fair, we have University of Wisconsin historian Frederick Jackson Herner using his own history on the significance of this ever-moving frontier from the time of the first colonists to Jefferson to ultimately the Plains Wars, culminating in the 1890 census where he realizes that there is no longer a frontier. And after 4 centuries of discovery in America, America has now fulfilled, for all intents and purposes, its manifest destiny. What's lesser known, and I did want to put a spotlight on it, is the rebuke given at that same moment in time and a counter speech given by Simon Pokagon of the Potawatomi tribe, in which he'll remark, "On behalf of my people, the American Indians, I hereby declare to you, the pale-faced race that has usurped our lands and homes, that we have no spirit to celebrate with you the great Columbian Fair, now being held in Chicago, the city of the wonder of the world. No sooner would we hold high joy the day over the graves of our departed than celebrate our own funeral, the discovery of America." And in fact, again, this is a story that continues onward through the centuries. In 1973, the American Indian movement and several Lakota and Ogawa activists occupy Wounded Knee, having an incredibly tense and heated standoff with American forces. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court does rule in favor of the Sioux Nations, claiming that the Black Hills were illegally seized and taken, and offered $105 million in compensation. To this day, the Sioux people have refused to take that compensation. And of course, more recently, we've seen examples through the protests at Standing Rock and Pine Ridge, the same places where Sitting Bull had made his last stand and the last major decisive battles of that so-called Great Sioux War had unfolded. And just to bring it all full circle, we'll sum up with a quote from Sitting Bull. "Let us put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children." And that had become sort of the ongoing mantra for these survivors of the Lakota Nation and their experience in their encirclement of American history. I know we went a little past time, so I thank you guys for being so patient, being a great audience, and best of luck on your exam. And we'll pick up next week with New York City ward politics in the 1860s. All right.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.